Jax and Rose. Jax is from my experience podcasting in the podcast caddy Jax Knits. Rose, I was a teacher for a long time and I was always Mrs. Rose, and J Rose is how I sign my poetry. So I'm sort of just combining those personas in this new space, Jax and Rose. It's everybody's first time, so thank you for joining me here. And the new year, new podcast, something new and different. And always with new, you have an opportunity to review from where you came and where you want to go, etc. That's what these transitions are all about. One of my guides at the moment has been this book, The Creative Act, A Way of Being. And I'm going to use this book through this episode. Jax and Rose, I hope, will come to you more often. It will be briefer episodes. So this episode today, even though I have loads of knitting to share with you, I'm just going to stay on this sweater and talk about this experience and integrate it with this book. And then I have another podcast coming out right after that is about an experience I had visiting with Mario Minetti, a tailor, and that was so much fun. And then I will also have Melissa Jenkins on again, and we're going to go through some of the knits I made in response to having my colors done, and an update on the color retreat that we're hosting. But today is just about the Snow Crocus by Midori Hirose. But more than it being about this sweater, the shift of this is going to be about us, the makers, rather than the objects we make, and what the objects we make, what they give to us. And that I want to just start off with The Creative Act, A Way of Being by Rubin. Many of you have probably seen this, and I've been trying to read this book all year. And the funny thing is I listen to it on Audible, and it just sort of comes through like water in my hands. And I have a hard time retaining it because it's in a way, it's common sense. In a way, it's just good information. But in a way, that sort of information that you have to live into has a way of just, well, it's the difference between water running over cement and water running over, running through a marsh. And I want to make of this podcast sort of a marsh experience where we can soak in some of the nuances of our making life and not race past them so quickly. So I'm going to read you a little bit of this today. The first chapter is sort of an invitation, and I really like it, the way it would kind of lead us into this podcast together. And he begins, everyone is a creator. Those who do not engage in the traditional arts might be wary of calling themselves artists. They might perceive creativity as something extraordinary or beyond their capabilities, a calling for the special few who are born with these gifts. Fortunately, this is not the case. Creativity is not a rare ability. It is not difficult to access. Creativity is a fundamental aspect of being human. It's our birthright, and it's for all of us. So I love that right off the bat. That's the thing that I want to keep exploring, is my birthright as a creative in conjunction with your birthright as a creative, and those conversations that we can have. One of the things I really want to stray away from is my creativity being something that is separate from your creativity. We are all wrestling with the same situations, in that we are wrestling with colors and fibers and bodies and clothing ourselves and making decisions, etc. And so it's a fun conversation to be a part of. Creativity doesn't exclusively relate to making art. We all engage in this act on a daily basis. To create is to bring something into existence that wasn't there before. It could be a conversation, the solution to a problem, a note to a friend, the arrangement of furniture in a room, a new route home to avoid a traffic jam. What you make doesn't have to be witnessed, recorded, sold, or encased in glass for it to be a work of art. Through the ordinary state of being, we're already creators in the most profound way, creating our reality and composing the world we perceive. And I just want to take a moment to see if that even resonates with us at all, because while we're already makers, a lot of us are very comfortable with that. And do we consider ourselves artists? I think there's a lot, when I look at the etymology of making versus creating, it's very interesting, because to make is an old German word, which is to fashion or to fit, whereas creating comes from the Latin, and it shares the same root with the Latin goddess for Demeter, Ceres, and it is to grow. And I think that's a real distinction, because while we knit, we are also growing ourselves. And I've felt this, but I want to keep experiencing this more intentionally, more and more. The way a lot of us approach knitting as a craft of making. And in that sense, I would say it is very skill-based, and it is very technique-based. Whereas creating, when you grow, you are making something, well, there's more, I think it's wrapped in more uncertainty, and it is more expansive. It feels to me more expansive than making. So that's the experience of how we take knitting off of just the needles and into our lives. And I can give you an example of that, if this being snow crocus, this coming from this beautiful color that I encountered this summer, and the colors gloaming from the Lambing Kid, and how I first used it in a SoHo square, and how I read a book by a director who so inspired me, and I sent her the SoHo square. How Amy Palko wrote a pattern called the Gallus scarf, and Charlene added gloaming to the Gallus scarf I wore. And between giving away the one and receiving the other, I definitely felt like, oh, I needed to make an object in gloaming. Gloaming for me as a color, it's a color, and we could talk about what shade it is and how it relates to, my season, etc. But it also relates to the book that I read by this director. It relates to her, it relates to Charlene, it relates to Amy Palko, it relates to it. All of those things swim through this color. Then the other piece, where the making is more than just this particular garment and this particular measurement, etc., is that I knew I wanted to make a garment out of gloaming. And as I went through the process of what garment it was going to be, there were several stops for me in that. There were several times, several sweaters and swatches that I tried to make that they said, you may not go down this path. And I'll talk about that in a minute. You may not go down this path. And so I turned to this sweater, and I knew that I was going to make this sweater and wear it on my first episode of Jax Rose. So in that way, it's very special to me. Like, this is a special garment inaugurating a new time in my life. And the fact that the pattern would be snow crocus, where we all know that a crocus is one of the first flowers that comes up in the winter and comes up out of, and this pattern is very much like this, out of a certain, I would say, crocus is not blooming in the warm temperatures of summer, it's blooming in winter, it's in spring, it's an act of courage to bloom at that time, and beginnings are always an act of courage. So, you know, and I love the size of a crocus too. I love that the first flowers of the end of winter are small. They don't have to be enormous acts. They don't have to be flashy. The fact that they are offering themselves this blossom against winter in and of itself is a beautiful thing. So I love that this is snow crocus. I didn't ever think when I fell in love with the color gloaming, there was no crocus in my mind this summer. But here it comes to be finished in, you know, to be brought to you in January in the time of crocuses. And this is what I mean about our knitting being more than the fiber and the color. We are part of the knitting, and all of the memory and decision making that goes into a garment is part of it as well. And that's where I think we have an advantage. And I use the word makers all the time, but I think making merely puts us in a frame of mind to tap into our creativity. But there's an aspect of making that doesn't need to be creative, that can be very task-oriented, and that's absolutely necessary and fine too. But for the element of our making that is about who we are and what we're becoming and dreaming into that and knitting into that, that really excites me. Someone just wrote me today about their frustration with finding time to make things, and the big difference between just seeing an object that they desire to make and finishing it and getting to wear it. There's in that space, and this is something I know for sure from 5 years of podcasting and hearing feedback from other knitters, there is a lot of vulnerability in that space. Will I like it? Will I execute it? Can I do it? How will I finish? What do I think of myself in this process? Who am I? Who are the other people who knit this sweater? What will people think of me in this sweater, or whatever it is I'm making? All of those things also exist. And they're the things that I think I also find the techniques of knitting interesting, but I also find that stuff utterly fascinating. And I actually find that I get a lot of feedback about that aspect of our making, about making our life with our knitting. And so in terms of this woman thinking about how to find time to knit, or what's a knitting practice that is kind to me and sustains me in the slowness of making, because as we all know, knitting is different than consumption. It's profoundly different than consumption, and it is literally, I would say, closer to a manual prayer, because you are taking your time, you're slowing down and taking your time in the faith that it's going to bring value into the world. And the value it brings into the world is you and your well, think of all the things that we get to encounter besides the joy of walking out in the world and going to the grocery store and having somebody say, oh my, isn't that a lovely sweater? Did you make that? I feel like that's a good thing. But the other thing that I think I want to really create into is this gentle affirmation of self through the choices I've made. Crafting and making the soft textures around you reflect you, and to feel good in that, to feel at home in what you're wearing, to feel yourself in what you're wearing. And this is just a slow process. I do think we have a head start with the fact that we're knitters, being invited into what he had to say. So let me go on. He goes to say, in each moment, we are immersed in a field of undifferentiated matter from which our senses gather bits of information. The outside universe we perceive doesn't exist as such. Through a series of electrical and chemical reactions, we generate a reality internally. We create forests and oceans, warmth and cold. We read words, hear voices, and form interpretations. Then, in an instant, we produce a response. All of this in a world of our creation. Regardless of whether or not we're formally making art, we are all living as artists. We perceive, filter, and collect data, then curate an experience for ourselves and others based on this information set. Whether we do this consciously or unconsciously, by the mere fact of being alive, we are active participants in the ongoing process of creation. So to refer back to the comment, the question I got today about how do I make time for my knitting practice, I think our knitting practice has to be more than when I have my needle in the yarn. It has to be the fact that I'm looking at light, I'm looking at color, I'm looking at silhouette, I'm paying attention to the sensual, sensory experience all around me all the time, and then practicing paying attention. And we get to do that so much more often than we think. We just stop and say to ourselves, notice, just notice. And like, what richness that would be to just ask of ourselves, you know I need to do like core exercises and things like that, but also if being human, this is what I feel of this short span of having a body to exist in and get to be human in, is I get to use these senses. So my answer to how to expand my knitting practice is when I'm seeing, go, oh, I am seeing. When I'm tasting, go, oh, I am tasting, and really be in those moments. Then when you're knitting, you will be in your knitting, and that helps build the muscle, because what I feel like what makes a really good knitter, when my knits are most successful to me, is when I'm in dialogue with the knit and I am listening to what the messages it gives me, and I get messages too, like I can't, I won't, this is too hard, etc. But when I push through those messages into, oh, this sleeve wants to be this way. Oh, let me look at this friend, this finished object to help me decide on the length. All of those micro decisions is what we are training ourselves to do. And it is not as hard as, you know, picking up brioche or something like that. It is literally a practice, a habit of mind of noticing your sensory inputs. And I'm going to, in the, rest of this video, talk about the decisions I made around this sweater and all the fine decisions for our real, like, hardcore knitting content. But I want to say that one of the things knitting gives back to us, and I want to be really clear about it, is it gives back to us a way to focus on detail. Focus on detail and not race past it. Race past it. What would cause us to race past it? I think like arbitrary deadlines in our head, or arbitrary ideas of needing to seem a certain way. But if the practice of making a sweater is being with yourself and celebrating the dyers and the shepherds and the sheep themselves and the pattern writers and designers and ourselves for choosing this silhouette and modifying it, working on the fit, all of that is to be in that song, to be engaged in that. It is the identical act to just plowing through and thinking, I see that, I want that. That's okay, but that's more making, and creating is what I want to keep practicing, because I feel like it makes my whole life richer. It doesn't just fill my closet, it makes my whole life richer. So to conclude this first chapter, He says, to live as an artist is a way of being in the world, a way of perceiving, a practice of paying attention, refining our sensitivity to tune in to the more subtle notes, looking for what draws us in and what pushes us away, noticing what feeling tones arise and where they lead. Attuned choice by attuned choice, your entire life is a form of self-expression. You exist as a creative being in a creative universe, a singular work of art. I love that for us, and that is literally my whole goal with this channel, is to be a creative being in a creative universe, in a creative community, and allow each of us the opportunity to know ourselves as a work of art. So today's chapter is about the making of the Snow Crocus by Midori Hirose. But of course, traditionally I would start with the sweater and its construction, but instead I want to start with me and why I made it and why I chose it. And the reason why I made it is because I had this beautiful color in my mind. The color is called gloaming, and it is a color developed by the Lamb and Kid. I used the Birdie, which is Surrey alpaca, and I decided that it was such a beautiful color that I wanted to make a garment in it. I thought, what glorious thing to take the Birdie and combine it with the sugar, which is a lace weight merino cashmere silk yarn. And so this sweater is composed of 2 strands of sugar, 1 strand of Birdie held together to create this garment. And this is the stockinette portion of the garment. And I did a video on Instagram talking about just even arriving at this sweater from this yarn. I originally swatched it for a different cabled sweater, but the cables were twisted cables. And so you knit into the back of the stitch, and it was very much about that strong texture. And this was too soft to uphold that strong twist. So that pattern I had to abandon for another garment. Then I saw a beautiful sweater, I think it was an Isair sweater, and I swatched for that. I mean, look at that. And you could do the sugar. I would think 2 strands of sugar held double would make this beauty. So I think I'm going to have to swatch. But I decided that it was a very delicate sweater and I wanted it to be in a neutral yarn and not, even though I loved this shade, not in this shade. And so I landed on the Snow Crocus. I always thought this was beautiful, and I knew that these cables are not such strong cables, that they would still show up in this beautiful soft yarn, and also the silhouette was soft like the yarn. So the sweater, the color, the silhouette all blended together, and that's how I landed on that choice. Now, of course, I did a gauge swatch, and the pattern is for yarn in a different gauge. And so there was some thoughts there on, could I tackle this? And this is the thing I want to talk about in this podcast, is you hit your first, I hit many obstacles in swatching for this sweater, but each obstacle, I just took it as information. And I would say that the metaphor, perhaps, not that I'm a sculptor, but of chipping away at marble and going, what's in there? What does this yarn want to become? The swatching process helped me chip and chip away at that. And it decided that it wanted to be a Snow Crocus. The funny thing is that the sweaters that I liked on Instagram, they fit closely, so I wanted a close fitting sweater. And the sweaters that I saw of it finished that I had saved were off-white, yet this is the color of a crocus, and so a crocus is a flower. I love the fact that my first object of this podcast is a flower that comes at the end of winter, that comes to mark the beginning of the days lengthening and change and spring and warmth and a new vitality. And the smallest of things breaking through winter is always a crocus. And I suppose if we think of winter as anything that blankets our imagination with this sense of both privacy, dormancy, impossibility, darkness, and the space, the shadow space to reinvent yourself or to pull something out of what has not been made before into what is made. And wow, you know, because what would a crocus be in the midst of a tropical garden? It would be invisible. But the crocus is special and is visible because it blossoms in this field that is not hospitable to it. And I would say that snow crocus, unbeknownst to me really, is more challenging of a pattern than I had thought. But still that sense of wanting to serve this yarn, or that life force that's in even a cold frozen ground that's stored up in there, is what came out of the experience for me. And it was very much like a snow crocus, I would say, in that I had to persevere through some, I would say, metaphorically, layers of ice, etc. So the first thing you'll notice that I noticed right away was that it was a 60-page pattern. And again, I want to speak to the fact that it's a 60-page pattern. Do we want all things to be readily accessible and easy and obvious right away? Well, sometimes we want that, and sometimes we want the slow intimacy and attention of something that we need to focus on. And well, none of the actual chart in here was difficult. It's still the construction was enough that I needed to pay attention. And so it was a 60-page section, 60-page pattern, many sizes. You've probably heard about this before. And two impulses that I encountered right away is that my yarn isn't the right gauge for the pattern, and the pattern's 60 pages. How do I save ink? Those were the two. Now, what I want to say is that there is a practice which I really want to dive into and share with you and show you, which is you can take any pattern at any gauge, adapt it to the yarn you have, if you're willing to learn how to do that. Or you can find yarn that meets the gauge of your pattern. Not one way or the other isn't better or worse, it's just two different approaches. But I know how to knit a different size and attend to the width, and I know how to attend to the length. The attending to the length is, if a pattern is written where they give row counts, it's going to be a little trickier than if the pattern is written where they give you linear measurements, like at this many centimeters, at this many inches, do X, Y, or Z. So the collar was, even though I didn't have the right gauge at all, the collar universally said, oh, at this many centimeters, you're going to finish the ribbing. So that was straightforward. But in terms of here and changing the gauge, that was more where I had to be that crocus and experiment and keep pushing through the uncertainty of what's going, am I going to pass out of the ground and see the light? And my hope for you in watching this is you start to cultivate that value for yourself, that no matter what, you will. There's a lot of language we use where we say we are this kind of knitter, or we can do that, or we can't do that. And I want to invite you into the possibility of that you can do anything. I mean, these words are so cliche, and living them is so different than encountering the words, but you really can persevere and make whatever sweater you want. So Snow Crocus was a delight to make. Some of the things I'm thinking about with it, though, is that perhaps this podcast format isn't going to be adequate to go into enough detail with you. So one thing I want to offer is I want an opportunity to knit this sweater with me. So I want to re-knit it, and perhaps you want to knit it too. And so what you'll need in order to knit this sweater is you'll need to have yarn, a good choice of yarn. And I'm going to just say straight off, superwash would not be a good choice of yarn. It is too dense and too heavy. You want a yarn that has loft, that has air. And I have an incredibly beautiful sweater called the Sewed Cardigan, and it has intricate cable work. It was such a glorious thing to knit, but I knit it in superwash, and I regret that to this day. So don't make that mistake. Do not knit it in superwash. I can't recall what the pattern asks for, but I knitted in 2 strands of sugar and 1 strand of Birdie. The second one I'm going to knit, I believe I'm going to use, I haven't swatched for it yet, Elmer, which is merino wool with a little bit of cashmere in it. It's one of my favorite yarns. It's by Diamond Lane, and I'm going to hold it with Birdie because I like the loft, and I'm just going to do it in a neutral color. I feel like with these cable sweaters, every single one of them could either be a color and a neutral, a color and a neutral. And honestly, I don't mind re-knitting a sweater twice and learning from the first knit and how I might do it differently in the second knit. So this feminine style for me looks very much, I mean, this looks so Gibson Girl to me. That's what I want to, I don't know, adjust on the next sweater. It's so much easier to wear a sweater when they're long on the one hand, but on the other hand, in terms of outfits, there's a lot of, I have to do a lot of knitting right here and then just lose it and tucking it in to suit these gorgeous sleeves and this formal top half. I personally think almost could end a lot higher, and it would be easier, and it could just fall into a very deep rib. So that's something that intrigues me about the wearing, because in the genesis of this channel, I really want to talk about not just the knits I've just made, but how to wear the knits that I've already made and what knits I am enjoying wearing, etc. And some guidelines on the wearing of our knits, which may sound like a small goal, but it really isn't, because it's actually really everything to me. Because to me, this act of having these incredible fibers, wool, cashmere, silk, suri, these incredible fibers, and investing in them, then I want to invest in a piece and make a piece, and then my time of making it. Then when you go out in the world and with this thing that you have put so much of yourself into, knitters know this, there's sort of a field around you of your making and your creativity and your vitality and those choices, and that field energizes you in so many other ways, and it's worth attending to. It talked about creating our experience of reality. What did all of those decisions do for me? It creates an experience of reality where I'm telling myself through these choices, I'm capable. I can manipulate the colors, the fibers, the patterns to get something I want, and I will persist until that happens. Perhaps just the act of knitting helps us recognize our role as ongoing participants in creating our lives. We create these garments, but we are also practicing creating our life through the garments. So I want to say about this sweater, some of my choices with it. It was a very intricate pattern, very beautiful. And it's funny because I think the piece in what I just read to you is to bring more awareness to our response. And if our response to the pattern when we see it is to feel overwhelmed, if our response to the pattern is to feel mad at the pattern, or if the response to a difficult pattern is to be hard on ourselves, those are all choices. There's nothing that says it's so. If your response to even watching me in this sweater is thinking something along the lines of she's a skilled knitter, or something about me and my choices, again, it's simply a choice of yours. But what's really exciting is to know that you are in charge of those choices for yourself. So I really want to share how to make this sweater. And so if you're interested, I would like to offer you that I have a Patreon in which I'm going to make the sweater again. I think I'm going to make it with different yarns and different color. I think right now in my heart I want to make it with Elmer, because I love Elmer so much. Elmer's mostly wool with a little bit of cashmere, and then and I love that color Cookie so much. It's kind of like fingering to sport weight, I would say Elmer is, and then hold it with Birdie again. So, but just have it be much more off-white, either Birdie in shoe or Birdie in vintage, but something really neutral. And perhaps when I do a second one, I will make it more cropped and fitted at the bottom, and I can show you why in a minute. But in terms of my approach to this sweater, I assumed maybe that I knew more than I did, and I had to relax and get to know the pattern. And that definitely is the case with this pattern. It's divided into sections, and the sections are beautifully illustrated at the beginning of them, but because there's so many sizes and lots of pages, your first response in printing it is, I don't want to print 60 pages. I'm going to go through and figure out only the pages are necessary, which is fine, but I found that I missed a few things when I did it that way. So I would just say print them all and be very meticulous in sorting them and maybe putting them in a binder or something like that so that they stay in order, so that you can mark the sections, etc. Is each section had an alphabetic label. The instructions would be like, from A to F, do such and such. And so you needed to have a means to keep track of that in your sweater. So I just used gift tags like this, and I might be able to insert, you know, it'll be vertical footage because it's from Instagram, what that looked like. Well, this is my crocus right now. But this was very fun. It was very, I always love in the knitting process knowing where I am. And her drawing style is really wonderful because while it doesn't do bird's eye view, it definitely gives you the whole circumference, lists where the front, where the shoulders are. It gives you a map to orient yourself. But it's your job to get oriented. It's all there for you if you get oriented. Because it has saddle shoulders, so these are the saddle shoulders, there are times where you knit the top down and then you will leave some of the knitting on holders and do the front a bit, do the back a bit. There's short rows in the back, which is wonderful. So to have short rows in your cabling is maybe a new skill for some people. And I've always been very intentional about being very clear where my German short row, where that one is that I need to resolve. And I mark that very carefully and don't get lost in that. The construction, I guess, I would say I made some assumptions and got lost, and I think I had to rip out because I was thinking it was a traditional sort of yoke sweater where I was making decisions on where my arm's eye would be, my armhole. But instead, I love the construction because you end up knitting down to where the armpit is on the front and the back, and then you pick up and you do short rows until you knit down. And that was lovely. And so you knit both of the sleeves and then you knit the body. The sleeves are meant to end higher and then resolve in a long, narrow rib. But I wanted it more casual. And again, I used a ready-to-wear sweater that I like. I used the way it fit me to help me determine how long I wanted these sleeves, and I'm really happy with them. And then I followed the same decreases that she would have had. There's no shaping here until you get to the ribbing, and it's just that her ribbing would have been much longer. And in terms of the length, I used a ready-to-wear sweater that I already liked to determine the length. Something I learned when I visited Mr. Monetti, the tailor, is he would look at me in a giant full-length mirror to determine silhouette. And one of the things I know about YouTube is it's always done in landscape, so it's harder to see the whole silhouette. But it isn't just making the object. The next and incredibly important aspect of it is how we're going to wear it and how's it going to live in our life with us. So I want to show you this sweater just with some jeans, but show you the full shape of the sweater. So I have to back up for that. So I have it just with denim here, and I decided to wear it with rather baggy denim. I hope you can see all the way around the whole, there's clogs, there's big deep cuffs. So there's some interest down at the floor to compensate, and some looseness down, and some changes in a fitted, we call this part of the garment, the pants, the carriage. It's fitted, and then there's very loose legs. And you can see in this sweater, there are fitted sections. So it's fitted around here, and then it's the only shaping happens here where you do just some decreasing. So it blouses over, and same here, fitted, loosening, fitted, loosening. So it has that same shape as these jeans. That's why I chose them. Plus the jeans are a dark color. But I also did make for Instagram, I made a video because I had my colors done by Melissa, and we have a whole retreat coming up, the color of making. And I was determined that I was a summer. And so this is one of my summer colors. I like to call it Invincible Summer. And from that knowledge, I purchased a suit, a wool suit that had lots of winter colors. And it was really quite wonderful because I didn't have to go get a garment to match this, because I'm starting to knit into my palette. And so I had trousers that fitted this sweater already. And that's on Instagram. The other thing you might notice about Instagram, I try to celebrate the making with music and movement. I honestly don't feel like a garment is done until I do that. It's sort of like the party I have for the sweater once it's made. And that's just part of my practice. A lot of people, it makes them uncomfortable. it's such a narrow, tiny little path of what's allowed for our women, of not to this, not to that, etc., etc. And I can't guess what everybody wants from me. I can't know. So I just have to please myself. But one person pleasing themselves, I hope, is an invitation for the next woman to please herself, and so on. And that we're like infectious dominoes saying, yes, this is our birthright to be creative, to be artists, to make things, and to enjoy what we're making. Creating this new space together, I just want to set the ground rules of being, if you're drawn to it, absolutely come back. Please like, please subscribe. And if you don't, then find some, I hope, and I really want you to find something that you do love and enjoy. And I will do all I can to make this space welcoming, inviting, safe. There needs to be that if we are talking about our creative lives. Our creative lives are so intimate, just making. Different story, but this is about creating, and we are creating ourselves, not just garments. And in that way, I will insist on an environment of kindness, an environment that allows for mistakes, allows for growth, allows for discovery. So if that appeals to you, come back and keep spending time with me. My heart is full. I absolutely love this craft. It has given me so much. It has changed my life. I can't unpeel that all in the first introductory podcast, but I can't wait to keep exploring that with you through sweaters, through tailoring, through poetry, through readings, through thrifting, through color analysis, through whatever it is we decide to explore. My mother's quilts, Lily's knits, a trip to New York to see what Debbie's making, all those things. Knitting has just been almost like the frigate that has led my life into so many directions I never thought it would take me, and I want to take you along. So thank you for tuning in to this first episode of Jax and Rose, and I hope you'll be back for more.